Welcome to Into Theology. My name is Wyatt Graham, and I'm joined by Ian Clary. We're in book 5, not of Calvin's Institutes, but of Augustine's Confessions. And there's like a lot in this chapter, but it's almost like Augustine in his beginning of his career. He's in Carthage, he goes to Rome, and then he goes to Milan, and he's dealing with all the cool ideas of life now that he's outside the home, which are like the Manichees and the philosophers, then eventually Christianity. He almost goes, it's kind of like he goes like full circle, because he grew up with a Christian mother, and then he escapes his mom in this chapter to go to, I think, Rome. I can't remember if it's Rome. Yeah, I think it is. But eventually he goes to Milan, where he hears who would become his mother's favorite teacher. In fact, she might already be in Milan at that time. I can't remember offhand. But it's basically begins to love whom his mom loves and is drawn back to Christianity. So
it's interesting too, because like so he becomes earlier in his life, he becomes a catechumen as a boy, right? Like that's what his mom and dad do for him. And then at the end of this book, of book 5, he ends it as a catechumen, but now by his own volition. It's kind of neat too.
Well, just as a note on his mom, I think we'll learn it in this. I can't remember offhand, but like basically right before he gets baptized in, I think, 386, he goes to these estates and tries to do like these Platonic dialogues about these really intelligent things, and his mom's there. And if you read, I read them somewhat recently, the first couple of them, and one of the funny parts is like he has his mom, and he's like, whatever, my mom can be a part of it. And then he realizes that she's like a genius when it comes to at least faith, not like a genius in the traditional sense, but she's like really insightful. And he's like, whoa, my mom knows things. Maybe I should have listened to her. Right before he gets baptized. So
is that the Cassiciacum? Or
yeah, exactly. So there's 4, they write 4 books out of there.
Yeah.
Recently I read the first couple, not the soliloquy. I can't remember what they were offhand, but it was like last year. So
he also has one with his son there too, right? Adeodatus.
Yeah, I believe it's called The Teacher.
Yeah, The Teacher, that's right.
I didn't read that one either. I don't know if that's out of that though, that time period.
I don't know.
I can't remember offhand.
Yeah.
He has, I think there's one on the academics, or on skepticism is one of them.
Yeah, Contra Academicos. He gets into the academics in this too, right? When he becomes a
skeptic. Which is kind of confusing, because I think of them as like Plato, but then there's also skeptics. I gotta figure out. So I'm just looking for him up here. So I read On the Happy Life and then Against the Academics. That's what I read.
Oh, okay.
So the happy life is like the goal of philosophy, how to be happy.
Yeah, I give a quote in my intro to philosophy course. The students for their final assignment can choose a quote from the history of philosophy, and one of them is from Contra Academicos on skepticism, which is actually really cool. So am I going to read something here or what?
Yes, you're reading, I believe it was section 5, the second paragraph. And this the theme, at least in my brain, or at least the cool phrase, is Mother Charity. So it's talking with people whom you disagree with, and Mother Charity can kind of lead the way. So
I don't remember if mine, he doesn't, my translation in the Loeb Classics it doesn't call it Mother Charity.
Is the word
supported by Love Our Mother? That's what it's called.
Love Our Mother's same idea.
Yeah. Wait, I wonder where it is. Oh yeah, Matt. What does he call it? Caritate Matre. Yeah, so
that's Mother Charity.
Yeah, for sure. I love this section in this book. I mean, the whole of book 5 is really great, but this one's helpful because he's talking about how you ought to be patient with other Christians that don't totally understand or aren't kind of at your level in terms of like, theological or philosophical understanding. And so and then how this Mother Charity really should be driving us in the way we engage with other Christians who kind of aren't at the same place. So I'll read here from this from the beginning of this paragraph. So he says, nowadays, when I hear someone or other of my Christian brothers who is ignorant about these subjects and believes one thing rather than another, I regard him with patience while he expresses his view, nor do I see him as having a problem if he happens to be ignorant about the situation and appearance of physical creation, provided that he has no beliefs that are unworthy of you, O Lord, creator of all. It is only a problem if he thinks his view is consistent with our foundational principles of reverence for God and goes so far as to assert obstinately what he knows nothing about. Yet when faith is in its cradle, even a weakness like this is supported by Love Our Mother until the new person grows up into a perfect adult and can no longer be carried about by every changing wind of doctrine. And it's so great. It's like, here you are, you're trying to recognize where this person is at. So long as they're not like really kind of screwing up the key matters of faith, the approach we're to have is actually not one of like being combative or obstinate, but really it's to treat this person with charity or love and to have a high degree of patience with them, which is really cool. And you actually kind of see him in a weird way now. He's not dealing with a Christian, but he kind of does that with Faustus, the Manichae, at the end of things with him, where he kind of really is he's kind of kind with him.
Well, the interesting part is like the way that like the Bible is so focused on how you should treat other believers because that's our basic material context. But I don't think it's necessarily that different between how we treat everyone. So, like, anyways, that's just a side point. But the one thing I want to know that's interesting about what he just said there too is it's someone who believes something like a secondary issue, something that's part of the natural creation, is a primary issue or part of the Orthodox faith in his language. So it's the case that it's someone who thinks something's more important than it is. It's like a hobby horse. So everyone's like, if you're not, I don't know, if you don't believe in my version of limited atonement, you're not a true Christian. It's that kind of setting rather than someone who's just hasn't learned something yet.
Wait, what kind of view of limited atonement do you have?
I have an unlimited view of it.
Uh-oh.
I don't know. I don't think too much about that, actually. I have no idea.
Just being a jerk.
I mean, it's like one of those like interesting questions that I just feel like there's not like a lot of Bible verses for, so I don't find it increasingly interesting.
It's interesting. I think you actually wrote an essay on this for, I don't know if it was Gospel Coalition Canada or your website, but remember how Augustine also treated the Pelagius,
Yes.
Early on in the Pelagian controversy, he was not quick to call him a heretic and to jump down Pelagius's throat. It wasn't until like things get entrenched and then he gets wider problems in terms of the empire where Augustine has to turn more about things. But early on, he's like, listen, like, let's at least hear the guy,
Yeah, I'm also going to write a second one because I think that's to just explain what you just said. But I actually think when it's just a theological problem, he writes Pelagius personally, and they talk like kindly to one another. And Augustine's hoping for the best, even though he disagrees deeply. Like but it's Mother Charity, and so I think really it's only once I have to read this, but it's only once things get so disastrous that like churches are being wrecked that Augustine kind of has to go Terminator mode. It's so obvious to protect people at that point.
It's kind of like it's similar to what my little book on Augustine and the Pelagian controversies is about, because he really has. Actually, it's funny now that I think about it, because the monks in Hadramedum at the end of his life, when they encounter his anti-Pelagian writings from earlier on, they're all terrified that he's denying free will. And so, what is Augustine's approach to these monks who are like in this backwater in North Africa? That don't have a great education? His approach is actually exactly this, with charity and love. He's saying, listen, come out, celebrate Easter with me, spend time here in Hippo. I want to teach you that even though God is utterly sovereign, we still have our free will, and how that all works. And he's really kind and pastoral with them. And so it's interesting that like even here in Confessions, we're seeing that same approach. Shoot, I wish I'd put this in my book.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's two sides of the Pelagian thing, but I think, I still want to write the second article because I think there's a limit to like, at one point you have to say Pelagius, you are literally doing work for the other team.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he says it that way, Augustine, but that's what ends up happening.
Yeah.
So there's got to be a balance, but I even think about it with, just with all these people we're hearing about now who kind of pastors who fall to like sexual depravity and all that kind of stuff. There's a limit. There's a point where you have to say you're too close to the things that Peter say about a false teacher.
Yeah.
Because remember, false teacher in the Bible is rarely ever about doctrine purely.
Yeah.
It's that, but it's connected to you're preying on women, or you're defrauding people of money, or you're doing it for whatever. It's usually like these ethical, moral desires for power or exploitation, or for sensuality. It's really interesting. But we're often intellectualize it.
And it's interesting too when you think about it in the context of the body of Christ and the church. It's like, because heresy and schism are basically like kind of two sides of the same coin in the early church. And so when he's going after the Donatists, he's hardcore about the Donatists. I mean, he's trying when he first gets to Hippo, to deal with them well, but he gets to the point where he basically calls for imperial persecution against them
because they're damaging the body. I mean,
because they're severing the body of Christ, and he's like, this can't happen. You guys got to stop.
Which I think in the text that you read is interesting, because we're almost flipped. Because for him, it's like, if you have a wrong notion, we can be best friends forever. We'll work on this. But if you have a wrong ethical, like if you're like trying to sleep around with people in the church or whatever, then he's like, you gotta get out. Yeah. And I think for us, it's almost the opposite. We think, oh, you have maybe in Reformed circles, not in every circle, obviously. In Reformed circles, you're like, oh, you have like one iota off of your doctrine of imputation or something. You're like, oh, you're out of here. But I don't actually don't think that's right. I think you're justified by faith in Christ, not by faith in doctrine.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so let's work through this. So in book 5 here, he's going to give the kind of justification rationale for why he will, he goes to Carthage to teach, and then he leaves Carthage, goes off to Rome, and then the book ends in Milan. Lots of funny stuff happens on the way. He kind of trash talks his students a little bit. I can't help but reading.
I think he finds in Rome like a similar thing anyways, though.
Yeah, well, he does. The students in Carthage are like literally like they'll just come smashing in through the door and like be idiots and stuff.
In Rome, they don't pay you. That's right. So the grass is never greener on the other side. So in context, Augustine's a teacher of rhetoric, how to speak well. Yeah. And in Carthage, he does it, but there's fisticuffs in his classroom. It's just like crazy. And he heard that Rome, they're calmer, but he goes there and they rip him off financially. So he's just like, this sucks. But then eventually his Manichae connections get him a job in Milan where he's a big deal. He becomes a like a state speak. I can't remember the role, but it's like a state-sponsored rhetoric.
The prefect invites him to come
which I didn't. And I just finished the Ambrose of Milan biography a little while ago, and I didn't realize there's a number of crazy things happening in Milan right now. There's like a split empire. There is the emperor, I think, sitting in Milan right now, and it might be Valentinian. And there's like this whole like anyways, he gets there like one of the most wild times in church history.
Yeah. But I mean, it's so funny, as a university professor, I mean, both of us are, it's kind of funny to think like how many years after the fact is Augustine writing confessions from when he taught in Carthage, and it's like he's like stinking students. He's like still irritating for him, and then like he I mean, to his credit in this book, like he kind of will make himself look like I mean, that is his point.
Oh no, he does, because he gives like a really embarrassing story about himself, about how he believed in like spirit food. Yeah, and then he says like, I know a lot of you might be like making fun of me at this point.
He's like, it's kind of okay.
Okay, he says, I can't remember, it's something to that effect. It's really silly.
And then he ditches his mother, right? This mom who cares for him. I mean, she is a little bit of
maybe a bit clingy.
A little bit clingy, kind of the helicopter parent, maybe. I've put it that way in a public lecture once and had some people make fun of me for it, but it's like she is kind of like that, It's like she's just hanging out with him, and he's like, okay, mom. And so then he's like, listen, I've got this friend I need to go hang out with here. Why don't you just go stay over at this cathedral near the port? And I can't leave yet for Rome until, I get this sorted. And
then he runs away.
But then like it's so interesting, the contrast that you see in book 5 between like those who are like ignorant yet proud. And that even as you say with Monica, it's like she has some real theological depth to her. And yet she's very humble. Like she's always like, she's weeping over her son. She's praying over him. He himself is proud. Faustus, the Manichae, is ignorant and proud. Even the philosophers that are going to save him from Manichaeism, he's also going to talk about their pride because they don't know God, because their pride's hindering them from doing it. And then Monica is like this real example of like what humility is supposed to look like. And then you'll kind of get into Ambrose a little bit at the end too, right? So there's these very interesting contrasts that he's framing. But he starts the whole thing off in point 2 of book 5, where he talks about the wicked having no rest. No rest for the wicked, as we say. But that rest there goes right back to the first book, where we're finding our rest in God. So these people don't have rest,
right,
because of their wickedness. Whereas Monica
he's teaching people to be restless.
He's looking for it. God's drawing him into the rest, even though he doesn't have it at that point.
And he seems to be contributing to that, because he's teaching people how to like speak and win arguments, but there's nothing really to it. It's just winning. And this is why when he decides to get baptized, he has this whole controversy of whether he can stay as a state rhetorician. And I think he does for like 6 weeks after he decides to be baptized. But it's controversial in a sense, because one way of looking at it is rhetoric is just convincing people, no matter if it's true or false. And it's obviously a Christian shouldn't do that.
Yeah, because there's that pride too, right? Like, I mean, he sounds a lot like Socrates, Socrates going after the sophists in Athens. Mm-hmm. You have all this beautiful speech, but you have no content of what you're saying, which again is proud, right? Like these are very prideful.
In Phaedrus, he has this whole conversation with someone under a tree about like speech and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, it's a big deal, because for for Socrates and Plato, obviously, the issue is, okay, you've got all this persuasive speech, but no content to it. And that means then, like, we can't really know things like what virtue, what, like justice, fortitude, those sorts of things are. So if we can't know virtue, all we have is persuasive speech with no content. You're going to live in a vicious society because it's not a virtuous one.
Yeah, and we kind of see that in politics today, where words don't mean much, right? So words are just symbols that you spout out, but they don't have anything behind them.
Think about what that woman right now, who is up for the Supreme Court justice thing, when she was asked about what a woman was, and she's like, I'm not a biologist. It's like, what a crazy, crazy thing she just said there. And Socrates and Augustine would all be just as appalled,
Well,
But
Plato was an anti-skeptic, right? So he's needed in this age because his whole thing is you can actually know truth. I mean, if you want a basic insight of Plato, it's you can know truth. That's what he's trying to get at. And he's wrong on so many things, I'm sure. But his basic point is, I can know what truth and justice are. So if you're robbed in Toronto and the person's from Vancouver, you can go to Vancouver and still say robbery is wrong. Vancouver's not gonna be like, actually, we're cool with that. In fact, in San Francisco, if it's under $950, I guess is okay. But anyways.
But it is interesting, right? I mean, this theory of recollection for Plato, the idea that, like, the soul is eternal and it floats among the forms and then has this fall. And then you have all this kind of inherent knowledge in your mind. Obviously, we don't agree with that. But the idea that, like, truth is objective, it's knowable, and it's transmissible, so that, like, you can teach it to the coming generation, that's super important. And I think this is what Augustine's kind of getting at a little bit here too.
Well, I just think it's so simple. Like one example is, like, if you see a couple who are married and they love each other, and you say, well, I want to experience that same love with someone else in my life, like you want a girlfriend, boyfriend, marriage, or whatever. Unless love is something real and objective, you can't.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's just going to be the neurons firing in your mind, and some individual experience is unrepeatable. And so love is real, justice and truth. So I just think that's the key. Now, here's a sentence he says about Faustus in section 7. He says of Faustus, Faustus, was not one of those many loquacious people whom I have had to endure, who attempted to instruct me and had nothing to say. I love that. I don't know. It's just one of those things where, like, we've all had this, where, like, someone says a lot and there's nothing there. Again, going back to politics, like, you can listen to to Parliament and the Q&A time, and it's like the art of saying nothing at all in an answer. And it's so frustrating.
Especially the Canadian one. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, especially
the British one's great. But
the British one's a bit better. Now the Canadian one, I'm sure, has the capacity to be great, but currently it's really hard to watch.
Yeah.
And anyways, I love that kind of phrase. But
even what he's saying, right? So he's making that point about Faustus, but then he'll go on and say in there, he really did have a heart, and even though it was not properly directed to you, still it was not totally improvident toward himself. He was not completely ignorant of his own ignorance, and he was unwilling to debate in a rash way that would force him into corners from which he had no escape or easy retreat. Even this made him more agreeable to me. He's like, even though this guy is kind of a fake, it's like he kind of knows. And when Faustus comes up against Augustine, he's like, I just can't be, I'm not at your level. And so, and Augustine kind of like appreciates that Faustus kind of recognizes that, even to the point where Augustine's willing to, like, help him read through some books of, like, ancient philosophy to try to teach the guy. It's like he's trying to help this guy who's supposed to be, the great guru, who, all the other Manichees are saying Faustus is going to be able to answer questions, Augustine, about, like, the nature of evil and whatever.
Well, yeah, it would be like some famous biologist. He'd hear, like, a lecture of someone who's famous for, like, evolution, and the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So the biologist comes alongside and says, listen, instead of mocking the guy on Twitter, he says, let me help you. Like, that's the difference, right? Like, it's actually just being a genuinely, like, human and good person.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, even that idea that Faustus has some good in what he's doing, even though he's bizarrely wrong, is kind of how Augustine talks about the philosophers too in general, because he goes through they're great at, like, studying numbers, mathematics, astronomy, like, all these great observations they're making, and, like, I'm so glad that I know it. But he's like, but they don't actually know your way, the word, like, they don't know Christ and his saving work. So it's like, it's not that they're bad, they have these deep limits that they can't get past. It's sort of like what you can know by nature and what you can know by grace.
Let me see what he says here about it. Sorry, I'm just looking, because he's contrasting the seductive eloquence that he calls Faustus's speech.
Section 3 is where I was at.
Yeah, he says his reputation had already been proclaimed to me to the effect that he was an expert in all kinds of worthwhile academic subjects, and particularly accomplished in the higher forms of learning, because I'd read widely among the philosophers and committed their precepts to memory, which is really cool. I compared particular teachings to those protracted myths of Manichaees, and what the philosophers seemed more likely to me, even though they had only the capacity to measure this present world, and despite the fact that they had never discovered its Lord. So he's like, and then in the next paragraph he says, the philosophers seek all this in their minds, and with the intelligence which you gave them, they have both discovered many things and have foretold many years in advance eclipses of the celestial bodies. Blah blah blah. He's thinking of Thales there. But then he's going to say, people who understand nothing of this field of study are amazed at this and stunned, while those who do understand it are proud and praise to the skies, but through their ungodly pride, they depart from your great light and fall away. So the Manichaees are the worst. The philosophers are good. They can talk about the things of this world, okay, but they don't know God, and that's because of their pride. And so therefore, even then, they're going to ultimately fall away, which is helpful for us, right? Like we're talking a lot today about Christian Platonism and rediscovering Aristotle, and there's big debates about all that. And we have to be balanced with it too, right? Because we don't want to just say, oh, Christian Platonism, that means we need to take Plato and Plotinus and everybody wholesale. There's a lot of problems that we have to be able to be honest about, that Augustine's obviously honest about. But it doesn't mean then just because there's problems that they shouldn't be useful either, right?
Right.
It's amazing to me. I'm kind of just working a little bit through some of the Aeneids by Plotinus, and I'm like, it's so interesting to read it and read Confessions. You're like, phew. Like it's just like, oh wow, like this is so indebted to Plotinus. But he's gonna say like, but there's limits here. Even a guy that I'm going to use like
he
Plotinus,
names Plotinus a little bit later too.
Yeah, he does. Yeah, the books of the philosophers.
Well, yeah, and I think there are limits. One thing to note too is that philosophy at this time included like what we call mathematics, physics, astronomy. So it wasn't like some like ivory. No, it's like everything. So for us, it would be like, man, a physicist really can understand angles and velocity really well. Like everyone has to admit that a brain scientist might be a philosopher in a sense.
Yep.
Like if I want someone to do brain surgery on me, I'm not going to go to like, oh, the X-ray tech's a Christian, but the brain surgeon's a non-Christian. So I'm going to get the X-ray tech too because they can really understand the brain. Like, no, I'm going to get the non-Christian who's a genius of the brain because I understand that they haven't, like as Augustine says, they have a mind and an intellect. They can discern basic observations. Nobody's saying you can't do that. But what they can't do is really know the true God. Or if they do, Augustine will say, using Romans 1, they end up exchanging the glory of God for something else.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating, by the way, because he kind of goes back to idols and animals. And then he opens up the chapter, by the way, chapter 5, with that even animals can praise you when we contemplate them.
Interesting.
And then you think about like the fall. You have animals on day 5 and humans on day 6, right? And or is right before?
No, they're both. It's a
day 6, right? But the right before. That's it, right? Yeah, right before.
Humans are the crowning achievement,
but then the fall is humans listening to an animal, to a snake.
Yeah.
And so there's a reversed order there of what like things ought to be.
Yeah.
So I mean, you see this a little bit in this chapter too, is all.
Yeah, I mean, he goes into Romans 1 quite a bit too on what is this? I don't know what section.
I think it's section 3
number
and 4.
3 and 4. He says he directly quotes from Romans 1. But who's he speaking about here? He's talking about
the philosophers in general. They have the mind, they can understand so much stuff, he says in section 3, but what they don't know is you, God.
Yeah, he says they speak many truths about the creation, but they do not devoutly seek him who is truth, the maker of creation. Therefore they do not find him, or if they do find him, even though they know God, they do not honor him as God or give thanks, and they dwindle away in their own reflections and claim to be wise by claiming for themselves what is yours. So with obstinate blindness, they also attribute characteristics to you that really belong to themselves, even ascribing lies to you who are the truth, and turning the glory of an imperishable God into the semblance of a perishable likeness of humanity and birds and beasts and serpents. And they change your truth into a lie, and they worship and serve your creation rather than the creator.
Which is also Calvin's view, like virtually identical. Any good work is one that's done for the glory of God as his end. And basically the same thing's true here. You can know truth, but it's not, there's with mendacity. It's also interesting too, like you see here in Romans 1, that same idea is like, as the image of God, you're supposed to go upward to God, but they're going downward to the creatures, just like the snake deceived and so on. And even though begin this chapter, it's only as we contemplate creatures do they have a voice. That because the heavens declare the glory of God.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a sense in which the natural sciences are just elevated here, like zoology or something like that, but in the right order of things. Is there anything else that's really useful? I mean, we've talked a lot all over the place. We didn't really go in
Yeah, we
order.
kind of jumped around. I mean,
That's
yeah,
fine.
there's
He
all
mentions original sin. That's
yeah,
interesting.
original sin is in here. I mean, again, he gets into evil,
Oh,
not a created
yeah.
substance.
Well, just name that
Shadow.
really quick. So, first of all, the Manichees believe that evil and goodness were both physical things.
Yeah.
But I
And
think goodness is a
ultimate,
little bit better because evil cleaves into it or something like that.
yeah. There's a superiority to the good, but
Yeah,
it doesn't. But the good is not all powerful, and
and
those
that
kinds
and
of
that explains the problem of evil because the good can't fully overwhelm darkness.
yeah,
Of course, if you read John 1, that tells you something different.
yeah,
So and then when he thinks about the God of the Bible, he can only think of the God of the Bible as like something in creation, and it doesn't. The Bible doesn't make sense to him. He says, for the same reason, I believe that evil is a kind of material substance with its own foul and misshapen mass, either solid, which they used to call earth, or thin and subtle as the body of the air. So that evil is basically matter. It just needs to be formed and shaped, right? Into good or something like that. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So, but eventually he finds out that, well, no, evil is actually when basically, well, I mean, it's something similar, but evil is basically a privation of the good. It's a lack of it. Everything you do pursues a good, and it's when you mess up, pervert, or corrupt that pursuit.
Yeah, and he's going to affirm too, right? Like that God is omnipresent. You know, really early on in this, like you know, the Catholic view. It's interesting in this book too, in book 5, it's the first time he'll use the idea of Catholicity or Catholic Church, small c Catholic. But yeah, he says certainly they have no idea that you are everywhere and that you're not confined to any one place and that you are uniquely present even in those who set themselves at a distance. And then it's great. It's like he's pleading for their souls. Let them be converted, therefore, and seek you, for you have not abandoned your creation in the way that they have abandoned their creator. So let them be converted. But like, I mean, good grief, there's so much in this. We could go on and on. I mean, he really, I think, makes the exemplars Christ is the in terms of Christ's humility. You know, when we're talking about that kind of distinction and who's the true humble one, it's actually Christ, the Word, right? They did not know the way, your word, by whom you made both these things that they calculate. Oh, this is that weird back and forth with calculating and calculate. And he says, by whom you made both things that they calculate, and themselves who do the calculating, and the capacity to reason that they employ in calculating, and the understanding by which means they make their calculations. But there's no calculating your wisdom. He, the only begotten, was made for us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification, and he was numbered among us and paid his dues to Caesar. They did not know this way by which they descend to him and away from themselves, and by him they ascend to him. Anyway, it's just interesting that he's using Christ's example as what true humility looks like, because it's the pride of the philosophers, the Manichees, and even his own self at this point, that he can't come to know God, but God in humility comes to us, so that we in humility then can come to him, which is really cool.
It might be useful to kind of bring it to end at the end of this chapter too, because so he begins with doing rhetoric. He goes to hear Ambrose, who does rhetoric, but then is slowly drawn closer to the true faith. And part of it is because the Manichees made fun of the Old Testament, maybe the New as well, and they read it just bluntly, literalistically, just not very well.
Yeah.
Then he begins to hear Ambrose genuinely teaching the Bible according to its own contours and context, and doing what he calls figural interpretation, which is a kind of like a theological way of approaching the Bible. And he finds like, oh, well, this is more spiritual. This is more like enlightening. He's just drawn closer. And then he says in the last paragraph, I think this whole last paragraph is fascinating. After he hears the defense of the Catholic faith from Ambrose and really good exposition of the Bible, which is key. He then says, I then energetically applied my critical faculty to see if there were decisive arguments by which I could somehow prove the Manichees wrong. If I had been able to conceive of spiritual substance at once, all their imagined inventions would have collapsed, and my mind would have rejected them. But I could not. However, in regard to the physical world, so that'll be key because he's going to be able to very soon when he finds Plotinus. However, in regard to the physical world and all the natural order accessible to the bodily senses, consideration and comparison more and more convinced me that numerous philosophers held opinions much more probable than theirs. Accordingly, after the manner of the academics, as popularly understood, I doubted everything. In fact, he's about to go talk about the academics, and he goes to is it Cassicorium, whatever it is, the place that he goes to.
Yeah.
I doubted everything, and in the fluctuating state of total suspense of judgment, I decided I must leave the Manichees, thinking of that period of my skepticism, that I should not remain a member of a sect to which I was now preferring certain philosophers. But to these philosophers who were without Christ's saving name, I altogether refused to entrust the healing of my soul's sickness. I therefore decided for the time being to be a catechumen in the Catholic Church, which the president of my parents recommended to me, until some clear light should come by which I could direct my course. So he still, remember, because my mom, he says earlier, I believe, that my mom taught me about Christ from the cradle. And so even I think it was the Manichees didn't fully persuade me because they didn't have Christ's name. And it goes back to that again. His mom's a good teacher.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like he talks about, because he gets sick in book 5, right?
Yeah,
and
he gets
then
real sick.
Gets really sick again, thinks he's going to die, but won't take baptism. But then he ends the book 5, as a catechumen in preparation for it. I love that stuff too, like about the figural reading or allegorical or whatever, because that's going to save him. And this is so, I think, important for us in our day. You know, I mean, obviously we want to affirm the primary role that historical understanding of like a text in the Bible takes, right? I was just reading recently Aquinas' commentary on Isaiah. You're like, whoa, this is so literal, you know, even though he gets attacked for his figural reading or whatever allegory, but it's very literal. So like the historical literal sense takes a front seat in interpretation. But for Augustine, he long struggled with the Old Testament as like kind of vulgar and barbaric, and then he hears Ambrose, who's reading and interpreting the Old Testament in a more kind of metaphysical way. And he says, finally, I heard one after another, and in fact, quite a lot of allegorical figures from the Old Testament explained, which when I took them literally were killing me, which is such a great line. Now that many passages in those books had been interpreted in a spiritual fashion, I began to reproach myself for my despair, insofar as I had believed that there was no possible way of withstanding those who loathed and derided the law and the prophets. And so it's actually giving him the means,
right,
first of all, to appreciate the Old Testament, and then to actually defend it. And so it's like the kind of like post-enlightenment stress on pure exegesis as only historical grammatical without the other senses of scripture. It will have that sort of effect, right? And it is recapturing that kind of more broader sense of the
and maybe like the simplest way to kind of just say it is like, allegory is basically when you read the Bible and you believe that God exists as the whole Bible describes him. So if you read a Bible passage that says like in Exodus, God is long of nose, you know that's an anthropomorphism. It's a sign that he's angry because that's an idiom. But because you've read the whole Bible, you actually know that God doesn't have a nose; he's spirit.
Yeah.
And so if you read that passage, you would just say the literal sense is this nose, of course, but even in the literal sense, there's a theological meaning here. And so it refers to something beyond itself. You kind of go beyond and think about who God is according to the whole Bible, and you're doing allegory. I mean, that's basic. I mean, that's oversimplified, but that's what it is. And I think today when we think of allegory, we think you read a text, then you talk about something entirely different. That's not what Christians meant. Maybe the occasional Christian meant that, but that's not what Christians meant. Allegory is just reading the Bible and believing that the God of the Bible really is real.
Yeah, that's hence the metaphysics, right? Like you need your metaphysics to be able to actually rightly interpret scripture. Now, here's an interesting way to end, totally coming out of nowhere. In a way, well, no, there's a segue. There's a segue. So
I'm ready for this.
Davenant Institute, right? One of their fellows is our buddy Ryan Hurd, and Ryan's been teaching Davenant Hall on the senses of scripture, and apparently his mom Christy is this like our sole listener to this podcast. So
we have two listeners, my mom and
yeah, maybe my mom does too. I don't know. But anyway, shout out to Mrs. Hurd, and doing well.
Thanks for listening.
See ya.
Bye, guys.